There are a lot of debugging windows available in Visual Studio. There are nearly 30 specialized windows. We've looked at most of those windows in other videos in this course. Let's examine a few more. They usually live inside this Windows menu. That doesn't look like 30 because some of the specialized windows only show up when I have a debugger attached to the application. So I'll choose Start Debugging, and then we'll go look in that Windows menu again. Be sure and put a breakpoint in the code or you won't be able to follow along. There we go. There's a lot more windows now. I'll start by talking about these windows: Tasks, Parallel Stacks, and Parallel Watch. These windows are useful when debugging code written to take advantage of the .NET Task Parallel libraries and the async and await language keywords. Async code is a big topic, one I'll save for another time. The same holds true with the Threads debugging window. It assumes you understand the threading model in .NET and Windows. The point I want to emphasize is this: when you are familiar with these topics, you'll find these debugging windows very helpful in understanding threads or tasks in your application. At the bottom of this menu are several windows that are useful when doing low-level debugging. What do I mean by low level? When you get away from the comfort of languages like Visual Basic or C# and need to look at debug information at the machine level or the assembly language level. So if you need to look at the raw memory, choose one of these debug windows. If you need to see the disassembled code, pick this one. If you need to see the registers in your CPU, choose this window. Let me show you one of these, the disassembly window. This is the disassembled code or assembly language, and you can see that interspersed with the assembly language are comments about my C# code. So I can see that here I'm declaring integer and I'm assigning the value of 3 to it, and then this line of code is the assembly language that actually does that work of assigning 3 to that variable. For the rest of the demos, I'll work with something called the modules window. Here it is. The modules window lists the DLLs and EXEs that are used by your program. At the moment, I see I have 3 assemblies loaded by the .NET runtime. I have mscore-lib.dll, I have my executable, and I have this Visual Studio debugger runtime. Because I'm debugging the application, Visual Studio has added this on its own. That's not something that would normally be loaded when my application is running on the user's computer. The .NET runtime only loads the assemblies that it needs. Let me talk about that for a second. I'll stop the application. I want to show you something. I have a reference here to system.core, but that didn't get loaded. It didn't get loaded because I'm not using any of the classes inside that assembly, but I can change that. Let me show you. Down here on this line of code, I'm sorting the information stored in this list of ints. Now, because I'm using order by here, that means I'm really using the enumerable class order by method, and that method is inside system.core.dll. Be sure and put a breakpoint in the code or you won't be able to follow along. So now when I rerun the application and start debugging, you'll see I have 5 assemblies loaded. Now I have system.core.dll and system.dll. So this means I get useful information. I know what the .NET runtime is loading, and if I look at some of the other columns in this window, there's other useful information. For instance, look at this optimize column. This tells me whether the code is a release build or debug build. So the only one that's the debug build is my executable. This column shows me whether Visual Studio was able to find the symbols file and load it. So the only one that was able to load the symbols file is my application. Over in this column is the location of the symbol files that were loaded. And then finally, this is the order that the .NET runtime loaded the assemblies. So it started out with mscore-lib, then it loaded my exe, then a couple other assemblies, and then finally the Visual Studio debugger runtime. Now I have more than one application inside this solution. If I make my WPF app to start up and look at the modules window, you'll see there are a lot more assemblies loaded. Looks like there's 17 assemblies loaded here. Most of these have to do with WPF. Here's the presentation framework DLL. Here's Windows-based. It also has the XAML assemblies loaded in here. So the point is, this window gives you a lot of information about what .NET is doing with your application. That brings me to the end of this topic. I think it's apparent that Visual Studio has an abundance of debugging windows. Once you are familiar with the purpose of each one, you'll know which ones to choose for your next debugging session.